There we go. All right, so we're back at it after having a week off. I am feeling a little better, not totally 100%. So if I have to mute, in the middle of speaking, I'm probably coughing. So I apologize for that in advance. But if you all saw my message from earlier today, after reviewing the content for miracles and the problem of evil, I thought that I should just circle back and do miracles today while I've got you here so that you have the ability to ask questions right now, because I think the content for the problem of evil is just easier. And so, what I'll do so that we finish this class on time, I'm going to record the problem of evil tomorrow evening, and then I will put that out as well. So, I'll get this recording out tomorrow. I'll record the problem of evil tomorrow as well, and we'll get that out there so that you guys can look at it. And then next week is our last class, so we'll have time to ask questions next week before I really get into the concept of God method that I use. And then that class should be a little shorter. We just won't have as much time. It's just kind of a culmination of practices that I use personally when trying to think about this stuff and put it to use when we're talking to non-believers. So we got a question already. Let's see, Ben, when do we get to debate you? Anytime. Excuse me. Anytime you want. So please, whatever you want to talk about, we can debate it if you want. We could definitely do that next week if you want to hold some open debate time. So that's no problem. So, um, but yeah, we can do that. Let's get to it tonight. So we are on. Oh, come on. There we go. Just a review from our last time that we were together. We talked about theistic arguments, where we talked about the structure of logical arguments, both deductive and inductive, and we talked about how to judge arguments. So we talked about how is a argument valid? Is it sound? Is it cogent? If these are things that are foreign to you, if you can't remember them, go back and review that. It's all up on the you can get it on the thread pretty easily. So we talked about judging arguments, and then we went over primarily four arguments. The cosmological argument, where we talked about how there can't be an infinite number of causes, regressing into the past. There has to be some, prime cause, some uncaused cause back in the way recesses of time, and that is the cosmological argument. We talked about the teleological argument, how things are, designed with purpose, and that purpose indicates a creator, a designer. We talked about the ontological argument, where you argue from God about his existence, that God is the greatest conceivable being, and anything that's greater, if you can conceive anything greater than that being, then that being is God. And then we talked about the moral argument, just that objective moral values exist, and therefore, we see God existing we see God's existence because of that. But we also talked about different forms of that argument and how you can put other ideas into that argument, like beauty or goodness or truth or whatnot. So if all that seems foreign to you, I encourage you to go back and review it, because those are really important, especially to grasp them to where you can kind of pull them out of your pocket and use them, not in such, rigid formulaic ways of doing it like we did last week, but really bring them into conversation and, speak with people in a very just easy manner. That's the kind of level you want to be acquainted with these kinds of arguments to be able to use them. So tonight we're going to talk about miracles. We're talking about different approaches to defending miracles. So miracles obviously are important to our Christian faith. Our entire faith stands on one miracle, that being the resurrection of Christ. And so it is important that we talk about it and we're able to defend it and really speak about it cogently, that we're able to talk about it not so much as mythology, but as something that has real historical fact behind it and something that has philosophical grounding and justification under it. So we're going to talk about two different approaches on defending miracles. We're going to talk about David Hume's argument and influence. I gave you the essay to read for homework. So you've had 2 weeks to read it. Hopefully, you got a chance to read that essay. That's probably the number one most famous piece of literature in all of philosophy about the study of miracles and miraculous events. There, you go on to any college course on modern philosophy where they're talking about David Hume, and they will probably mention that essay. It is that impactful. It has had so much influence over the last nearly 300 years. And so it's something that we need to get to grips with. We need to know it decently well and know what he's arguing. We're going to talk about his argument. And within his argument, we're going to talk about three specific things. One, what he calls uniformity of experience, beliefs on evidence, what he believes evidence is. He's got certain classifications for evidence. So we're going to look at that. And then we're going to look at how he says miracles are a violation of natural law. And then we're going to look at really C.S. Lewis's response. Uh, C.S. Lewis is an interesting character in that I personally I'm not really drawn to a lot of his writing. It's just it's he's writing for a very specific audience, but when it comes to what he said about miracles and his writing on miracles, I tend to think that C.S. Lewis is we're going to remember his name for a long time simply because of what he wrote on miracles. We may not People may not read Mere Christianity 100 years from now, but I feel like scholars are still going to be talking about his book on miracles. It's that important, and it's had that much of an influence in Christian philosophy. So we're going to talk about his objection to naturalism and his argument from reason, and how he approached Hume's argument. And we're going to talk about probability and uniformity from his perspective, and how he kind of deconstructs those ideas in Hume's argument to really take it apart and show how it's contradictory at its core. So that's where we're going tonight. That's what we're doing. And then I will get started, and I hope my voice does not give out because I feel like it's going already. And so, but differing approaches to miracles. So there are two primary approaches to defending Christian miracles, and this should sound very familiar because it's really set up and it's structured in some of the things we've already talked about in this class. There is a historical approach, which we could call the evidential approach, and then there's also the philosophical approach, which we could call the presuppositional approach. And I've talked over and over again in this course how there's I wouldn't say necessarily a divide, but there are differing approaches in apologetics, evidentialism and presuppositionalism. We've talked about those before. But what they mean is these two approaches, they're not at odds. They can actually go hand in hand. They can work together. And so I don't want you to come away and think that we have to choose one or the other. We can use these together. They should be used together. But what we do have to say is one approach is primary and the other is secondary. And what I mean by that is the philosophical question must precede the historical question. If we're going to argue about miracles, we have to understand the philosophical reasoning behind it before we can go and try to present evidence, historical evidence. And so so we must question, and I've said stuff like this before all of our class, we must question the worldview before we actually present evidence. And so on our next slide here, we actually have a quote from C.S. Lewis from his book of miracles. It's a bit of a long one, but he says, the question whether miracles occur can never be answered simply by experience. Every event which might claim to be a miracle is, in the last resort, something presented to our senses, something seen, heard, touched, smelled, or tasted. And our senses are not infallible. If anything extraordinary seems to have happened, we can always say that we have been the victims of an illusion. If we hold a philosophy of the supernatural, this is what we always shall say. What we learn from experience depends on the kind of philosophy we bring to experience. That's very important right there. What we learn from experience depends on the kind of philosophy we bring to experience. That's going to be kind of a linchpin in David Hume's argument when we look at it tonight, because his philosophy is different and he's interpreting experience through that philosophy, through that philosophy or that worldview differently than what we would. Lewis goes on to say, it is therefore useless to appeal to experience before we have settled as well as we can the philosophical question. And so when I talk about the two different approaches, we have to evaluate the worldview first. This is what Ron Nash argues. This is what C.S. Lewis has argued. This has really been the approach for the last 100 years and how we talk about miracles. Before, a lot of people tried to present historical evidence, and if you know anything about biblical scholarship, especially within the universities in the West over the last 200 years, there's been a lot of attack on the reliability of the Bible and such. And so a lot of scholars would try to, really dig up a lot of historical evidence about how to prove that the Bible was truthful and that we can trust it. And that's fine. But if you're presenting all that evidence to someone who has a philosophical worldview that is completely different and just flat out denies that evidence from the get go, you're never going to get anywhere. And so the evaluation of the worldview, the philosophical question, comes first. An abundance of historical evidence will not change the worldview. And I think we can all agree to that. That no matter how much evidence, and I've said this over and over again in this class. We talked about this with the theistic arguments. It doesn't matter how many arguments you use against a person if their worldview is dead set against Christianity. You have to evaluate that worldview. You have to talk about it. You have to really bring up problems within that worldview and tear it down and show where it's contradictory before you can present evidence for the faith. And so that's where we're going tonight is we're going to be looking at that philosophical worldview where the presuppositions must be challenged. People have to understand that miracles can happen before we actually give them evidence that they did happen. So those are the differing approaches. I'm not going to pause for questions there because I feel like that is pretty, we've covered a lot of that before. So we're going to get right into David Hume's argument. And this is, I want to give time to this, and I want to be able to pause for questions when we're looking through it because David Hume's not easy to understand. And so Hume, if you don't know, he lived 1711, 1776. So he died, right around, right at the birth of our nation, pretty much. So that's the kind of time frame we're looking at for Hume there. He was a famous Scottish philosopher. So he was well acquainted with the church. The Scottish were notoriously reformed at that time. A lot of them were, and he was arguing with a lot of reformed theologians at that time. His major beliefs that he's known for throughout philosophy, really, epistemological empiricism, which means how we gain knowledge. We gain knowledge only through our senses. Hume really pounded on this belief. He believed that our sense data, gathering knowledge through our senses, was how we understood the world, how we gained knowledge through the world. He wasn't any kind of idealist or any kind of intuitionist where he believed that, knowledge comes from outside of us or anything like that, that it's implanted in us. No, he believed that we gather data, knowledge about the world only through our senses. He's also famous for what we would call epistemological religious skepticism. And that's just a fancy way of saying we cannot have knowledge about religious claims. So, what a lot of people will attack, especially like young Christians, you'll see them in, philosophy classes as freshmen or something, and they'll say, oh, David Hume was an atheist. And well, no, he wasn't actually. He wasn't an atheist. He never really claimed that he doesn't believe there is a God. He would say that we can't know that there is a God. So he's a skeptic and an agnostic of sorts. What his major claim was that we cannot have knowledge that any religious system is true. And so he would say to the Christians in his community surrounding him that, even if Christianity is true, I'm not saying it's not true, but even if it is true, we can't know that is true. And the reason we can't know is because knowledge only comes through our senses. We only gain knowledge of the world through our senses. We don't gain knowledge through some kind of revelation from God. So that's an interest. I can give you some more literature on that if you're interested in understanding that topic more. It's neat. It's a neat thing to read about. And then another major belief for Hume is the worldview of naturalism. It's the view that denies anything exists outside the natural order. There is no supernatural out there. What you see is what you get. And so if the universe is conceived of this kind of this circle, everything within the circle is the universe. There is nothing outside of it that can penetrate the circle or come into it. What you see is all there is. And so he was really famous for these beliefs. And so this is kind of the worldview that we're dealing with when Hume is attacking miracles. We have someone who believes that knowledge only comes through the senses. We cannot have knowledge about religious truth claims because, special revelation does not exist, because naturalism is how we view the world. There is no God out there outside of the natural order that divinely transcends and penetrates the natural order and reveals himself to us through, the incarnation of Christ, or, a book written by several men in the Holy Spirit, that we see as God's word. That doesn't happen. We don't gain knowledge like that. It only comes through our senses. And so that's what we're dealing with when we're dealing with Hume. And of course, he wrote the essay that we read for homework for this course, or this class. And so now we're going to call it Hume's soft argument. If you go on to read anything about David Hume, he's often characterized as having people interpret his argument two different ways: the hard way and the soft way. The hard way is pretty much not accepted by anyone anymore, and the reason why is they take the hard argument to mean that Hume argued that miracles could not happen. Hume did not argue that miracles could not happen. He's making an epistemological argument. He's a skeptic. He argued that even if miracles did happen, there's no way of knowing. And so that's the soft argument, and that's what we're going to proceed to talk about, because that's pretty much what everybody is going to talk about. And the reason why we're talking about David Hume, if you go on to read about miracles in any apologetics textbook, they are going to talk about David Hume. They'll probably talk about a few other guys like Anthony Flew, but Hume is the main guy the apologists are going to talk about, who's attacked miracles in Christianity. So Hume's soft argument, he argues for the incredibility of accepting miracles, not the impossibility. I already said that. He argues for the incredibility of accepting it, that what we'll see is there's so much evidence against it. We have no good reason to accept miracles. What he says is that a miracle is by definition a rare occurrence. And I think we can agree with that. It's not something that happens every day. It's something that is definitely rare. However, he says natural law by definition is a description of regular occurrence. The evidence for the regular is always greater than the evidence for the rare. Okay, so right away, what we see there in that third point is he's pitting natural law, how things commonly occur, the regular, against miracles, something that happens rarely. A wise man always bases belief on greater evidence. Now, this is Hume's argument. I'm not saying this is a good argument, but a lot of people have attacked this point, where he says a wise man always bases belief on the greater evidence. And so then he gets to, therefore, a wise man should never believe in miracles. So again, to sum up the argument, miracles are rare. They don't often happen. And I think we can agree with that. And then he says natural law, so how we understand, and Again, this gets into his empiricism, using our sense data, how we understand the world, the things of um, how nature works. Natural law is by definition regular occurrence. The evidence for the regular is always greater than the evidence for the rare. A wise person will always base belief on greater evidence. So he's always going to base belief on the regular. Therefore, a wise man should never believe in miracles. Again, we don't see Hume saying that miracles do not exist. What he's saying is that we have no good reason. And this is a very modernistic argument. This is very, um, you see in this kind of argument the seeds of Darwin's evolution and its natural selection. We are people of science. We believe in facts and figures and numbers, and what we can't take the testimony of some book written by an ancient race 2,000 years ago as truthful. We have to understand what we can see before us, and that evidence always outweighs the rare occurrence. And so he's not arguing that miracles are impossible. What he's arguing is that it's really not acceptable to believe in them because the evidence so much outweighs the regular occurrence over the rare. So I want to pause here real quick because this is kind of difficult. Yeah, does anybody have any questions so far? Check up here. All right, I will take your silence as a no. So that is Hume's soft argument. Oh, come on, what are we doing here? Oh, yes, and I'm trying to this down here. I wrote Norman Geisler, Miracles in the Modern Mind. This is how Norman Geisler has formulated Hume's argument. If you read the essay, you know that Hume never gives you a point by point definition of his argument. And so I actually took this formulation of the argument from Norman Geisler's uh, his his journal article, Miracles in the Modern Mind. That's actually a really good article if you want to write that down and read it by Geisler. It's one of the premier pieces of literature in miracle studies today that you can go in and read. It's great. So, Norman Geisler, Miracles in the Modern Mind, really gives a good overview of Hume. And he also talks about some people who followed Hume. So, moving on. So, some of the things that we want to talk about with Hume, some of the big ideas behind Hume, human uniformity of experience. And so Hume assumes that experience is uniform in presenting enough evidence that one cannot believe in miracles. What that means is that our the way that we interpret the world, the way that we gather data, our empiricism, our epistemological empiricism, how we gather data through our senses, it gives us enough experience, it gives us enough data to say that how things happen is uniform. So people don't resurrect from the dead, they die and they stay dead. That's pretty much what Hume says in his article. He says, people don't resurrect from the dead, they die and they stay dead. And so what he's saying is there's a uniformity of experience in the total number of deaths that have happened across human history. And he assumes that experience is all uniform, that since most of the deaths that we know of have always happened that way, that then all of them have happened that way. And that uniformity presents enough evidence that we really have no good reason in believing in miracles. And so it's like saying so many people have died and stayed dead, even you have no good reason for believing that Jesus rose from the dead. That's kind of what he's saying right there. So this assumption pushes also into future events given Hume's naturalistic framework. And what we mean by that is Hume will say that since from the dawn of time, people have died and stayed dead, and we don't really have good evidence to believe otherwise that they raised from the dead and are resurrected. Our uniform experience shows that they have stayed dead. we have good reason to believe going into the future that people will continue doing this and miracles will not continue to happen. Let me check on this right here. So, is he using a universal negative? Hmm. Yeah, I would, I don't know. I've never heard anybody talk about that in that language, David. So I don't know. The problem with it is that how can we know all future events will conform to naturalism? How do we know that? I'll have to think about that. Is he using a universal negative? I think so. I think you would have to say that if he's saying people never raised from the dead, I think that's a universal negative, and the burden of proof is on someone who uses a universal negative. That's It's just like when an atheist says there is no God. Well, that is a universal negative. That is someone claiming to have um, universal knowledge that there is no God out there anywhere. And so that is a really tough position to prove. And so, yeah, even though I haven't heard anybody use that language, David, I would say that, yeah, that's probably a universal negative in the sense that miracles don't occur. But again, I don't want to put that strong of language on it because Hume is arguing that the evidence is so strong against miracles, we have no good reason for believing in miracles. He's making an epistemological argument, whereas if we said miracles could never exist and they don't exist, that's more of a metaphysical argument. That's more of an argument about the nature of the universe, that miracles just don't happen. Hume is making an epistemological argument where he's saying we simply cannot know if miracles exist. So I would say that, yeah, it might be perceived as a universal negative, and people who have interpreted Hume's argument as that hard argument have seen it that way. But I want to be very careful in using language like that because he's not denying that miracles exist. What he's denying is saying we have no good reason for believing that miracles exist. Does that make sense, David? All right, well, I'm going to move on. So, the problem is how can we know all future events will conform to naturalism? So, if 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 uniform experience presents evidence that, miracles, we have no good reason for believing in miracles, that everyone in the past has died and stayed dead. Well, how do we know that won't change in the future? And the thing is that we don't know that. We can't know that. It's impossible to know that. Just because the sun has risen every day from the dawn of creation does not mean it will rise tomorrow. I've heard you guys have heard that argument before, I'm sure. Hume argues for what's called special pleading or select experiences over uniform experience. So what the problem that Hume has had here, and a lot of people will point this out about his argument, is that he's not presenting an argument of uniform experience. Okay. He's just making what we would call special pleading. He's saying that, well, most of the people in history past have died and stayed dead. Therefore, we should have enough evidence to rule out any good reason for believing in miracles. That's called special pleading. He cannot make an absolute case. He cannot make that, to use your language again there, David, he cannot make an absolute universal negative going back into history to say that he has evidence that everyone has died and stayed dead. He cannot claim that he cannot make a claim that Jesus did not rise from the dead. He doesn't have that evidence. He's only saying that, or he's only able to give us the possibility that it didn't happen. And we have so much evidence that people normally do not raise from the dead. Therefore, we have no good reason for believing in miracles. Again, it's an argument about our knowledge and about the data that we gather. Therefore, he's really arguing about probability too. And so he uses the language of uniformity of experience or uniform experience into the past, and he pushes that into the future into his argument. But what people have shown, they've come back and they said, this really isn't uniform experience. We don't know that everyone who has died has stayed dead. And then we don't know that's how it's going to work throughout all future experiences. And Hume, you can't possibly know that. It's impossible. And so, really, that's kind of a notch against Hume. He uses this idea of uniform experience, but many people have gone on to show this isn't uniform experience. This is special pleading. So, again, I want to pause here real quick. This is difficult stuff, maybe some of the most difficult stuff we've done in this class. I want to make sure everybody is on board, see if there are any questions.
Hey, Ben.
Yeah.
So early on in our discussion, just correct me if I'm wrong, but where you're saying that David Hume is saying what you see is what you get, correct?
Yeah.
So is he basing that on probability, like to say that once you're dead, right? There is no afterlife, there's no supernatural. So if he's making that assumption, then why wouldn't he be more dogmatic and everything after that? And that's what I was getting at with the universal negative, that, he may be presenting a case to the common public, but, it seems to me in his heart of hearts that he probably doesn't believe any of this exists. If we're suggesting that what you see is what you get, then I'm assuming he's making the assumption that there could be an afterlife or, a God or whatever. So that's where I was just a little.
Yeah. So, Hume's approach to all that would be, there may be a God. We just simply can't know. And so he's very slippery. I think in his heart of hearts, if we go back to our Romans 1 verses 21 and 20 and 21, there's knowledge of God out there and people have refused to believe it. They've pushed it aside. And I think Hume, unfortunately, growing up in a very religious context, wants to find any way he can to push that Christian belief out of his world. He doesn't want to accept it, and he wants to give himself any excuse he can to not believe it. He understands that the universal negative in atheism will not work. He cannot say there is no God, miracles don't exist, because people have said that throughout history and they've been soundly defeated. He takes a different route and says, there may be, we simply cannot know. And so, and to just to give a little background, Hume and another major philosopher that we've talked about in this course, Immanuel Kant. They are really responsible, in the late 18th century, early 19th century, for laying the groundwork for a lot of skepticism about the Bible that took hold in university theological schools and stuff like that. And so, where you had a lot of liberal theology grow to where we couldn't believe the scriptures anymore, David Hume is responsible for a lot of that framework where he is saying we simply cannot know God, and that's built into his system of epistemology. Yeah, you Christians say that God has divinely revealed himself through the man Jesus Christ. We can't know that. There's no sense data to tell us that. You Christians say that God has divinely revealed himself through this book. Well, we have no sense data to say this is actually God's word transcended down to us, that he has handed to us. To the natural eye, it just looks like any other book. And so I think it's good that Christians read David Hume to understand just the absolute chaos and devastation that he left upon, that he helped to leave upon Christian theology in the next 200 years after his death. He just, he and Immanuel Kant did so much damage that it's really sad that so many theologians try to adopt their philosophy and bring it into theological studies. And really, what they did was they abandoned miracles, they abandoned the Bible and whatnot. So, and that's a long rabbit trail there. I apologize for that, but it's really important that we understand Hume and what he's trying to do here. Are there any other questions?
So
Oh, go ahead, Rick.
You often hear about Thomas Jefferson, snipping out the miracles from his Bible. So he was pretty much a contemporary of Hume's, I guess.
Yep.
So is that where his influence was?
Partially, yeah. He's coming from Hume so the three major movements or philosophical movements that really go against, seeing scripture as the word of God, as divine revelation, as containing truth content, and really deleting miracles out of the Christian context, are Hume, Immanuel Kant, and the British deists. And Jefferson, although he wasn't British, he's American. He definitely was a deist, and he definitely was reading the British deists and was heavily influenced by them. And so, a deist is someone who believes in God but rejects all special revelation from God. So all we know about God is from general revelation and our natural theology we build off that. And so, yeah, absolutely, a person like Thomas Jefferson is in that vein. Very, very skeptical about what we can know from, the Bible, divine revelation. And that's why I'm always very cautious when I hear people say, this is a Christian nation. I was like, well, a lot of our founding fathers were deists. They didn't believe what we believe. So we got to be careful when we say that. So anyways, that's getting off into another rabbit trail, but you're absolutely right, Rick, in what you say there. Any other questions, comments? All right, I got to get moving. We got a lot to cover. So beliefs on evidence. Hume believed that the evidence of miracles was outweighed by the evidence of non-miraculous events. And so we've already kind of talked about that with his argument and how the regular always outweighs the non-regular. And so he believed that evidence of miracles was outweighed by evidence of non-miraculous events. But the problem is that Hume doesn't really weigh evidence. Going back to our idea of uniformity, he doesn't look for evidence of miracles. What he says is that, well, most people die and they don't come back to life. They're not resurrected. So what he does is he just adds more evidence to his argument. He just lists, we have all these people in in history past that have died and they have stayed dead. So this functions as evidence. But what he doesn't do, he doesn't actually go and look for evidence of the resurrection. He just simply, denies it or simply walks away from it and keeps adding more and more evidence to how he sees it. So he's not weighing the evidence per se. He would like people to think that he's being objective and he's trying to see both sides of the thing, but he's really being quite unfair, and that he's just looking for more and more evidence to support his point of view and completely neglecting the evidence for the miraculous. Adding more evidence is adding more non-miraculous events. An example is, and we've been using this all night, the resurrection of Christ. Hume adds up the number of deaths to outweigh resurrections. Death is uniform or more probable. And again, David, you were talking about probability. When we get to Lewis, we're going to talk about how Hume doesn't understand probability quite right. And he definitely doesn't understand uniformity. And so his belief on evidence it's flawed. Because he's not practicing it objectively or scientifically, looking for the senses. He's simply just trying to add more evidence to his point of view. And what he ends up doing is that he actually proves too much. And what he goes on, really what a lot of people have thought he believed is that humans cannot believe in miracles, even if a miracle does actually happen. And so, and I've said that, I've been saying that all night about his views of, theistic beliefs or religious beliefs, where, he's not an atheist. He's a skeptic. He would say that God could exist. Hume he might have even gone to church on some occasions and sat in the pew and sang some hymns. He might have thought that was a good way to bring the community together. He was very adamant about community value, and he wasn't opposed to the church. He valued the church for the kind of sense of community it brought together in people. But what he's saying is that what he would say is that even if God does exist, or even if a miracle did happen, we simply cannot know if it happened. And so his beliefs on evidence are a little wonky because he doesn't objectively hold them in one hand and the other. He's not really weighing evidence. He is simply adding more and more evidence to his side of things. And he's not being a good scientist or a good empiricist in what he's doing. He's not looking at all the evidence. He's looking at special evidence that only speaks to his cause or the way that he thinks. So that's pretty simple. I'm going to move on to the next part because I don't think that's too difficult to understand there. Um, and then also miracles as a violation of natural law. Now, probably many of you have maybe thought of that miracles are a violation of natural law, but the way that Hume put this out is because of uniform experience and beliefs on evidence. Hume argued that miracles are violations of natural law, excuse me. Natural law, how we understand the world to work, is known through our sense experience. And sense experience argues for non-miraculous events. All right. And so no, and this is the real problem here. No educated, and notice how I italicize that, educated person has observed a miraculous event. This is where if people read Hume today, especially in our politically charged culture, where Hume is almost, Hume's, if you read the article, he's almost a racist. That he talks about people being, barbarians, and people being uneducated, and nobody who is educated would ever believe this, that really gets back to his views on accepting revelation as evidence. That he would say, well, these people from 2,000 years ago, they don't understand the world like we enlightened folk do today. There's definitely a sense of I want to say elitism in Hume when he's making this argument. There is a sense of ethnocentrism in his argument, and so we want to be very cautious with him because that's really dangerous to argue that way, that we know better than everyone else. Now, I'm not saying that happens across, or that's not applicable, or pardon me. I'm not saying that isn't the case. Sometimes some people actually do know better because they do actually have better experience of some things. But Hume's making a very modernistic argument. We people today know better than those barbarous people who lived in the times of the New Testament, and that's just simply not the case. That's just if you read if you read some of the literature out there by William Lane Craig and Gary Habermas about talking about how well educated and how people understood the world at the time of the New Testament, you know, they weren't like these, slack-jawed yokels that didn't know anything. They were very intelligent people. People still understood how the world worked. They may not have had the same systems of science, and they may not have had the same economic progressions that we did, but they understood how the world works. But back to this. Hume's arguing natural law is known through sense experience. Sense experience argues for non-miraculous events, and no educated person has observed a miraculous event. Now, uneducated people may have observed a miraculous event. People who are barbarians may have observed a miraculous event because they don't know better. They don't understand that the natural world is the only thing that exists out there. They believe in supernatural things. And so what Hume would say is there is no sense experience for miracles, and therefore miracles belong to something other than natural law. It's not that it's not so much that miracles like penetrate the natural law and they kind of break up our metaphysical reality, and it's something different that happens. That's not what Hume is saying here. What he's saying is that we understand the regular way of the world to be known as natural law through our sense experience. All right. And non-miraculous events, they are not shown through sense experience. So miracles, they belong to something other than natural law because there is no sense experience for miracles. And so that's how he formulates his argument that miracles are a violation of natural law. And so those are the big ideas that we get from Hume. You have that uniformity of experience. You have that idea of what constitutes evidence in Hume's argument, and you have natural or miracles as a violation of natural law. Those are the pillars or the axioms that his argument is built upon. Again, he is not arguing that miracles don't exist. We simply could not know if they exist, and even if we had some evidence, we have no good reason for believing they exist because there's uniformity of experience through history past that shows us that they don't exist. And so that's what Hume is arguing. And unfortunately, this has been very influential. And some people still argue this way today. Although I would say that this kind of thinking is coming out of fashion as we move into a more postmodern culture. We're not so modernistic in our beliefs anymore. And so those are the beliefs of Hume. And so the results here, and then I'll break for questions after this. So the results of his argument is that he sets the primacy of sense data for knowledge. And we've talked about this at the very beginning, talked about his empiricism, that we can only know things we can only have knowledge of the world through our senses. What Hume did was establish that this type of knowledge is higher and better and greater than any other type of knowledge that we can have. And I think that we all as Christians would understand that we reject that. We say that there is types of knowledge that are beyond our senses. There is intuitive knowledge or things that are implanted into us. There are things that we reason to that we don't necessarily use sense data to get to. And so that's one of the results of Hume's argument, though, is that he sets empiricism on this pillar above every other kind of knowledge out there. He also set qualifications for what is believable testimony. And if you read the article, and we talked about, no educated person would believe in a miracle. Hume really sets some unfair qualifications of how we can believe testimony, that we would have to be educated persons, that you would have to be willing to lose more than you gain in order to believe a miraculous event. It's just all these kind of outlandish qualifications that really just they're unfair. They're not objective. They're not weighing the evidence. They're really stacking the deck against miraculous events. Miraculous events are violations of natural law and cannot be observed. Again, we just talked about that. It's not so much that a miracle is something that changes the way the world works. It's that we cannot observe miracles because it's not part of our sense data. It's a rare occurrence that we cannot observe because it's not part of the natural order. And then also uniformity of past events can predict future events. We talked about that with uniformity, just because Hume would argue that the sun has risen, from, history past. And so it will continue to do so. Well, there's a lot of problems with that argument. Yeah, we may have a reason to believe that it's going to rise, but it's not completely uniform that it always will. Eventually it's going to burn out. The Earth is going to stop rotating. Even science says that. So there's some problems with his uniformity of past events predicting future events. So, oh, oops. Well, let me go back here. Sorry about that, guys. So that's Hume. Do I have any questions before we go on to C.S. Lewis's response to Hume? All right. Check my time here. Okay, we're doing all right. Hopefully this will go faster, although I think Lewis can be a bit difficult to understand in this argument. Lewis's response, naturalism and the argument for reason. These are two major objections that Lewis is going, or this is one major objection Lewis is going to have to Hume. Hume's argument hinged on presupposing naturalism. When we talked about that Hume brings to his argument a naturalist worldview. And so which really disqualified him from weighing evidence. He just didn't want to see any kind of evidence for miracles. And so Hume's argument really hinged on naturalism, presupposing naturalism. And so naturalism, again, is nothing exists outside the natural order. And so what Lewis began to realize is if naturalism is dismantled, then Hume's argument fails. And so Lewis set out to not necessarily just prove that miracles can happen, he set out to disprove naturalism. And so what he did was he critiqued naturalism as a worldview, and he did this by using human reason as example. So what he did was he wanted to show that human reason exists beyond the natural order. And so his idea was if I can show that something exists outside the natural order, naturalism saying that nothing exists outside the natural order, if I can demonstrate that something has its origin outside of the natural order, then we have reason to question naturalism, and then Hume's argument fails because it presupposes naturalism. And so that's what he does. Naturalism believes nothing exists outside the natural order. Lewis believed that naturalists took human reason for granted as existing and having its origins in the natural order. And we see that today, even today, where evolutionists will argue that our rational abilities, they are the product of time plus matter plus chance. It's all these chemical and material causes from time past that have built up over time, and we have received all these rational genetic traits from our ancestors, and that has led to how we reason now. And Lewis did not agree with that. He thought that that is not a good explanation for how we get human reasoning. And so the problem is that if you take the naturalist view of where human reason comes from, you get a non-rational order or origin of rationality. So you get something that starts from non-rationality and somehow builds up to human rationality. That's a huge problem because the burden of proof is on the naturalist. And so the question you would ask is, can human rationality have origins and causes and explanations that are non-rational? Can the way that you and I think, the way that we communicate with each other, the way that we understand each other, just all that, the laws of logic, everything we use to kind of make sense of this world in our own reasoning, does that come from non-rational causes? It just come out of this kind of cosmic primordial soup that just led us to where we are today? And so Lewis took evolution and natural selection to be non-rational. And so this is a huge problem that Lewis sees. And what he's going to say is that I don't think this is how it works. I think that reason actually has a supernatural or I guess we would say supernatural origin to it. And I think we can agree with that. We would see that in the Imago Dei and Christian doctrine and theology, that God gives his image and likeness to us. And part of that is our ability to think rationally. So let's see here. Lewis says that all possible knowledge then depends on the validity of reasoning. So this is a direct confrontation against Hume right in this first sentence. All possible knowledge is not built out of sense data. All possible knowledge depends on the validity of our reasoning. What that means is in order to make sense of even you and me talking right now, that depends on our reasoning. It doesn't depend on gathering of sense data. Of course, sense data can help, but it depends on our ability to reason. And if the feeling of certainty, which we express words like must be, and therefore in sense is real perception of how things outside of our own minds really must be. So if we express how reality is outside of our own minds, then this is well and good. But if this certainty is merely a feeling in our own minds and not a genuine insight into reality beyond them, so if our feelings that what we say about truth is not, making observations and statements about the truth, the objective truth out there in the world, if it's just the feeling in our own minds, if it merely represents the way our minds happen to work, then we can have no knowledge unless human reasoning is valid. No science can be true. And so, what Lewis is saying here, this is very, very important, right? He is saying that if our reasoning does not point to something true and objective outside of ourselves, and that we are working to make sense of it, then we have no reason to believe our senses or our rational faculties at all. If they are merely about our emotions and how we feel and how we just feel and perceive the world, we have no reason to trust them, because the problem becomes, what's to say my observation and feelings about the world are better than yours? Or why are yours not better than mine? This is a huge problem. Lewis is saying that we can't have this buildup of sense data. We can't have this buildup of, material and chemical causes through evolution that just gives us these feelings about how things are. There has to be some real perception of how things are out there, and that has to come to us outside of the natural order. It's not something that we just make up from within the natural order. This is a difficult idea to understand, but it's very important in understanding Lewis's argument. And so what Lewis would say is that if human reasoning was the result of determined material processes, aka evolution and natural selection, then we have no good reason for believing that any belief is true. Again, that's why I said that if we're just if our reasoning is just a product of time plus matter plus chance, then we're not really arguing about true things out there. We're arguing about our feelings and how we perceive things to be. And who's to say that my perception is better than yours? Who's to say that yours is better than mine? We really can't, because there is no objective truth out there. There is no objective truth that we are reasoning to. It's all just this sense perception. And so he goes on, and I've got a few quotes with Lewis here because I think Lewis best speaks for himself. But this, as it seems to me, is what naturalism is bound to do. So it's bound to say that our reasoning is the result of determined material processes. I think that's a typo. It offers what professes to be a full account of our mental behavior, but this account on inspection leaves no room for the acts of knowing or insight on which the whole value of our thinking as a means to truth depends. So it doesn't, the kind of reasoning, the determined material processes that the evolutionist or the naturalist will argue for, they give us no good reason for believing that what we know is true, it's valuable, that we can depend on it. There's a reason to question it. We can't even know science if it's true or not if our rational faculties are merely the product of material processes. And so that's what Lewis is arguing there. And so what he'll argue is that reason has to be from outside of the natural order. It is not from inside the natural order. It is not a product of material causes. It comes from somewhere else. He doesn't go on in Miracles to argue that it comes from God or anything. All he's trying to do is dismantle naturalism by proving that something comes from outside the natural order. And he does very well and very effectively argue that reason, although he doesn't tell us in that book where it comes from, it does come from somewhere outside the natural order, or else we have no really good reason to believe why our knowledge of truth is true. Is we have no reason to depend on it. So let me pause there real quick just to ask if there are any questions, because this is some tough stuff to understand. So are there questions out there? Man, I must be a good teacher. All right.
You are.
Thank you. Did you have a question, Rick?
No, I just wanted to make you feel good.
Thanks. All right. I got to move quick. My voice is going, guys. All right. So, supposing if naturalism is true, if the value of reason is in doubt, then one cannot establish it by reasoning. We can't reason our way to reason from these natural causes. All right. Something that has to come from somewhere else. And so we cannot trust our processes of reasoning in a truly naturalistic worldview. I've kind of already said that. All forms of reasoning are dependent in naturalism. All forms of reasoning are dependent on materialistic events in the past. The problem, and this is a big problem throughout all apologetics, and you can use this in different cases. But there's a problem when we look at human reasoning. We talk about materialistic causes. You know, how far back do you go with your causes to show that something rational actually happened? You can't go back through an infinite number of causes. It has to start somewhere. Reasoning has to start somewhere. And unfortunately, not unfortunately, just fortunately for us, the naturalist just has no good explanation for this. They really have to chalk it up to time plus matter plus chance. And honestly, I think that takes more faith than actually being a Christian and believing that, God put your reasoning there. So reason must be dependent on something beyond the natural scheme for Lewis. So now we're going to move into the second part of Lewis's argument. And this is difficult. I would really encourage you guys, if you've never read it before, it's not an easy book to read, but if you get a chance to read Miracles by C.S. Lewis, it's well worth your time. I genuinely believe that it's going to survive a couple centuries in history because of the contribution that he's made to this field of study in it. The rest of his stuff may not survive, and that's understandable. But I think this has some longevity to it. We're going to talk about, probability and uniformity. Lewis argues in his book that there's a biased judgment of events by modern historians. And what he means by that is that all historians will use naturalistic explanations for events in the past, and all of those explanations must fail before a supernatural one can be accepted. So in the case of the resurrection, and I'm sure you guys have probably heard this stuff popularly before, in passing conversations, but the resurrection of Christ, and you actually see this in the Bible where the Jews in the end of Matthew, they say, hey, place a guard there because we're afraid his disciples are going to come and get him, because they said, Jesus said he was going to rise after 3 days. The Jews do that. And so you even see this in the Bible. But, all these naturalistic explanations must be weighed, and they must fail before a supernatural one can be entertained. So in the case of the resurrection, the disciples came to take him. He wasn't really dead. He just appeared to be dead. And he got up from the tomb, which is literally physically impossible. And this is where the other side of investigating miracles, the historical evidence, the evidentialist really comes into play, because they just show how improbable some of these naturalistic explanations are. And it's great stuff. There's some really great information out there about some of these events, but that really shows a bias and a closed worldview that will say we need to test all these naturalistic explanations first, before we will ever even entertain a supernatural explanation. So much so that the improbable natural explanations are preferred over supernatural explanations. As an example like this, excuse me, a miraculous event sometimes will occur where people will see, I don't know, visions of angelic beings or whatever. I'm not saying I believe these or anything. I don't know if they're true or not, but a lot of times explanations will be offered. Will they say, well, this group of 500 people is experiencing group hallucination or mass hallucination. They will, that is so improbable that all these people are hallucinating at the same time, versus just saying, well, this is a supernatural event. There's a real bias, a worldview bias against accepting supernatural events, so much so that the natural explanation sometimes is way more improbable than the supernatural explanation. And so Lewis really starts to play on this in his book. And so the worldview of Hume and people who followed used probability to make a case for past uniformity. But there's a problem with that. They would say that a miracle is the most improbable event. Hume says that it's more improbable that a miracle occurred than any kind of naturalistic explanation. But I just talked about the mass hallucination. I mean, I'm not an expert in probability, but how improbable is that to say that these 500 people are hallucinating versus, well, this being really did present itself to these people. You really have to go out on a limb of faith on one side more than the other, I think, and it's not necessarily the theistic side on there. So Hume, he starts talking about probability, but Lewis says, now, of course, we must agree with Hume that if there is absolutely uniform experience against miracles, if in other words they have never happened, why then they never have. And that's common sense. If miracles have never happened, they've never happened. Unfortunately, we know the experience against them, excuse me, to be uniform only if we know that all of the reports of them are false. That's very important. Right there. That sentence. We know the experience against miracles to be uniform only if we know that all the reports against them are false. And so again, we go back to that universal negative that David was talking about earlier. Hume was trying to argue for this uniform experience, and he really wasn't. He was kind of doing this special pleading, but Lewis is coming and really holding his argument to the fire and saying, hey, if you're going to use the word uniform experience, excuse me, you must claim to have knowledge and experience of all past events. Otherwise, you cannot confidently claim that they are all false. So you must have evidence to the contrary of all miraculous events in the past. Otherwise, you have no business claiming there is uniform experience that says miracles are false. And we can know all the reports to be false only if we know already that miracles have never occurred. In fact, we are arguing in a circle. So, and this is brilliant. He shows the circularity of the argument. We know experience against them to be uniform only if we know that all the reports are false, and we know all the reports to be false only if we already know that miracles have never occurred. there's a circle there that we're not actually reasoning to this conclusion. We are bringing in a worldview that says miracles cannot happen, therefore miracles cannot happen. Hume is arguing with a worldview that says miracles cannot happen, therefore we know the experience against them to be uniform, only if all the reports are false, and we know that all the reports are false because we know miracles have never happened. It's completely circular, and he tears Hume apart. He starts to tear Hume apart here. So it's impossible to know uniformity. What Lewis goes on to argue is it's impossible to know uniformity through nature. We simply just cannot gather all the data that happen. We cannot make a blanket statement. And we already talked about this earlier in Hume's argument for uniformity. Uniformity must be assumed before experience can prove anything. Therefore, there's another typo, sorry. Probability that no miraculous event occurs depends on uniformity. However, uniformity is not probable. We can't accept uniformity because we know we can't go back into the past and search out all those events and provide that universal negative. But uniformity it is, but this kind of assumed uniformity, it assumes before these experiences can actually be proved. And so the probability that no miraculous event has occurred, it depends on that uniformity, but uniformity can't happen. It's not probable. And that's what Lewis says in his argument. And so he's showing the circularity of how Hume argues. And excuse me, I'm beginning to lose my voice. I apologize. It is impossible to judge the interference of nature by a supernatural power by studying the probability of nature. And this is another huge problem with Hume, in that Lewis will say, well, you can't, of course you can't look through the natural senses and can't gather natural data to try to understand miracles, because so much of what happens in miracles is supernatural. It's something that's giving you different evidence and different data. And so you can't know about a supernatural event by studying the probability of how often things happen in nature. It's not right. It's impossible to know that. Oh, and that's all I've got. So sorry, I thought I had one more point there. So that's what Lewis says about probability and uniformity. What he pretty much is arguing for is really the circularity in Hume's argument, that you have to have uniformity to make the case that there are miracles, that the probability that there are no miracles that happen. And again, I've argued all night that Hume wasn't making an absolute blanket statement. He was saying that it's most likely that there are no miracles and we shouldn't believe them because we don't have enough evidence. He wants to use this uniformity to argue for a probability. However, uniformity is not probable. It's just not possible to achieve his argument. And so you really can't study this kind of thing through the natural law, through natural causes, and expect to come out and understand something about miracles. And really what Lewis has done here, by showing the problems with probability and uniformity, by undercutting naturalism, what he does is he doesn't really give us a good a counter argument as to why we should believe in miracles. I mean, he does a little bit in the book, but what he does is he really presents us with major problems of Hume's argument. And we have to understand why he's doing that. He's writing to a context of people. You know, we're talking, he wrote this book in the early 1940s. So in England, so we're talking a very modernistic society. We're talking about a people who held a lot of the same worldview values that we showed with David Hume at the beginning of the presentation. You know, they're taught, they believe in empiricism. They believe in religious skepticism. They believe in some kind of epistemological skepticism that we can only we can't know things through other means beyond our sense experience. And so that is the context Lewis is writing to, and he's saying in Miracles, if I show these major problems of Hume's argument, which represents modernity, which represents the context of my people, if I can really undercut his argument, I can really make great headway in showing my culture how we can go back to believing in miracles and how they actually do exist. So all that's C.S. Lewis. Now I'm at the end of this. Are there any questions? Do you guys, any statements or anything anybody want to add to what we were talking about tonight?
I'll just make one comment. I've not interacted with an agnostic in it to any degree that noteworthy. But what I can say is the arguments employed by Hume, driven by his understanding of our ability to know God, is replicated by those who are Orthodox Christians, but I would call hard cessationists. So for me, listening to how Hume was thinking about it helped me understand more clearly how hard cessationists understand things. The arguments of, well, because miracles have stopped based on Scripture, now therefore any evidence of a miracle must be someone who's deluded, right? And you made the point about, I've heard that, well, it was mass hypnosis as the solution to the problem. So my point is I thought that was good, and it kind of links to what David was saying. Although they're coming from different places, some of the tactics employed were similar. So that was good review for my mind to hear that, so I can sharpen myself on how do I respond. So hearing some of Lewis's arguments, and also I really like Keener, Craig Keener, right, who wrote all the documented, I don't know, hundreds of miracles in the New Testament, as helping with some of the evidence to say, you're really making hard statements based on your presupposition. You're judging the evidence based on your presuppositions, as opposed to, well, I can't just wipe this away. Anyway, simple comment that this doesn't just apply to agnostics. Some Christians think like this.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And to your comment about Keener, and we didn't really get into any historical evidence tonight, guys. This is just meant to be a introduction. This is the very tip of the iceberg. You could take literal graduate courses of 16 weeks long where you study miracles the entire time and you just dive headlong into the evidence. And there's some great stuff out there. And I'll have some books mentioned tomorrow when I do the recording for The Problem of Evil. But there's some great literature out there if this is something you're interested in. We just, for the sake of time and me just wanting to introduce you all to this type of argument and this type of thinking, but there's a lot of good stuff out there that we didn't even touch tonight, and some really bright minds. One of the head research professor at Liberty University, where I go to school, Gary Habermas, is considered the world's leader in miracle investigation and study. He is one of the foremost authorities in all the world on this subject, and so it really great stuff out there. And so yeah, Keener is another one of those where he's studying the historical events of the New Testament, and we could do a 10-week course just in this and never cover all that stuff. So any other questions, comments? All right, all. Well, hey, I will get the problem of evil recorded and posted for you. I'll record that tomorrow night and post it on Wednesday so you guys can see it. Please write down questions if you have them. Although I do believe that the material is even easier than this material that I presented tonight. I don't think that you will have difficulty in understanding it. Again, it's just a real snapshot and an introduction to it. but there's some good stuff in there and how we respond to really what is the most formidable challenge, I think, in apologetics to a Christian faith, and that is the problem of evil. So you will be well, I won't say well versed, but you will understand how you can begin to speak into that problem into people's lives, and it's something that touches so many people on a philosophical and emotional level. So I will have that all to you, and then I will see you all next week, or earlier on Sunday, if not before then. So
Thanks, Ben.
praying for you guys, and
Yeah.
thank you for sticking with me, and we'll finish up next week.
Right.
Thanks, Ben.
Good night.
Thanks, Ben.